The addition of high speeds and multiple execution venues has altered the equity market structure in recent years. Now the SEC is weighing in with newly proposed rules on dark pools. Meanwhile, IEX, an alternate trading venue, is trying to move from ATS to full-fledged exchange. PDQ ATS's Keith Ross says transparency is a good thing, and that while a market pause can be good for an ATS, as a full-fledged exchange, it could create chaos.
With the issues that other ATSs have had in terms of their regulatory fines and compliance, there's been a general cry from the public and the street to create more disclosure around ATSs and how they function. And I've always thought that any client or customer, potential subscriber that wanted to know what we're doing, we're happy to tell them, but the commission feels as though this should be public record and everyone should have access to the same information. So it will require very extensive filing about the procedures and the processes of how the dark pools work. And they're hoping that that will make people more comfortable with using them and being in the marketplace. It seems a little bit of an overreaction in terms of how extensive it is, but some have argued that the exchanges are regulatorily heavy and the ATSs have been light. So they're going to catch up very quickly. Being an ATS is not going to be a picnic anymore. The cost is not going to be that high. And if that's the tipping point for you to decide not to go into business, you probably weren't supposed to be in it anyway. In terms of information about process, information about type of client, I think that's very appropriate. Getting down to specific clients, certainly if this is going to be publicly available, that does not seem appropriate to us or to our clients. An extensive part of the proposal is the conflict of interest between an ATS and the broker-dealer that has to sponsor the ATS. And some of the broker-dealers trade for themselves. So if they have access to that information about the trades, that would be considered a conflict. Having users understand that potential conflict would be a first step towards them deciding whether or not they want to send their orders there. If this helps increase investor confidence in the marketplace structure, it's absolutely worth the time. And, even though I'm not a fan of more regulation, I think it would be beneficial for the marketplace.
IEX made a big splash in trying to slow down the market, but PDQ has had a pause built into its venue for years. What's happening here?
IEX, in an effort to segregate the market, introduced a speed bump, which is applied both to orders going into the market and coming out of the market. And they also post their quotes. So their quotes go through the same speed bump. It's 36 miles of fiber optic cable. It ends up being 1/3 of a millisecond. But every single order that goes in or goes out has to go over this bump. It's a technological impediment, I believe, to an efficient market, but they've convinced their clients that it makes the market more fair, and they've gotten a lot of traction with it. The PDQ pause is a structural pause that allows us to do good things for the order before it gets executed. So when a client sends an order to PDQ, they've agreed to a pause, and it's variable, so we can change it based on the customer needs. While we're holding the order, we send out what we call a request for trade, very similar to an RFQ, to our market makers, and they respond the same way that the floor used to respond to someone saying, "How's D Suite?" Well, the crowd would respond, who was first, who was best, would get the trade. We create the same competition. We bring back the information of the marketplace of where the market is, bring it to the order, and then execute the order against the book that we create. So we believe that our pause is very inclusive, it's very constructive, and we don't make any presumption that we know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. Everyone can participate in our process, and it doesn't matter what kind of trader you are.
So what's the problem here? Ross says it's all about IEX's idea to move from ATS to exchange. He says they're different, and the rules are different, and they're different for a reason.
One of the issues they have to deal with is their speed bump. So what they think is a benefit actually becomes a hindrance to the public market, if you will. So the commission's in a tough spot. The way I think of it, they can do one of three things. They can either say yes to IEX, And I believe that will create chaos in the marketplace. And let me explain that for a second. When IEX puts a quote up as a protected quote as an exchange, everyone will be required to send their order to IEX for execution according to Reg NMS. If it turns out that that quote's already coming down, but it's being delayed through the speed bump, it effectively is a ghost quote. And if you have to send your order to a ghost quote, you're going to get very frustrated. Meanwhile, other exchanges, if IEX gets approval, will probably institute the same type of a metric, maybe a 500 microsecond or an 800 microsecond delay. So there'll be quotes all around the street that are phantom, not going to be good for transparency and disclosure and getting your orders done. So what actually is a feature as an ATS, I think becomes a major flaw as an exchange. That's if they approve the model as it is. They could also say no and tell IEX that they have to change their model and take the speed bump out, which would make them look like any other exchange. Or the third option is they could change the rules, which I think also would be political suicide, because it would look as though they were trying to accommodate this particular exchange when all the other exchanges have had applications in this direction that have been denied. And the critical element is, as an exchange, they would have a protected quote. And that changes the game for everybody else, not just for IEX. We believe the markets are very efficient. There are some liquidity issues out there that need to be addressed. We have some ideas that we're going to bring forth in the next quarter that we think will help people understand where the market is a little better, give them an opportunity to move on from the speed race to creating liquidity and trying to solve the issue at that level.